So welcome everyone. So glad to see you here. I'm Lisa Miller. I'm the director of the journalism program, and I'm really thrilled to introduce John Christie to you. I met John, we won't say how many years ago, but when I was a UNH intern candidate. And I had to go down to the Gloucester Daily Times and do a story, and I had to stay overnight, and I was terrified. But John made me very welcome in his home, fed me nice dinner, sent me out to do the story, and I survived the experience because of John, so I always remember that. As you know, John is the editor-in-chief and the co-founder of the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting. He's had a long career in journalism, including work in Massachusetts, Maine, and Florida as a writer, editor, general manager, and publisher for newspapers. He's won numerous awards as a reporter and editor, including twice for Best Public Service Reporting in New England from the AP, and he was the primary editor at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel with 2 Pulitzer Prize finalists. He's going to talk to us today about leaving the false god of journalism behind. So please welcome John.
Thanks, everybody. I don't have a microphone. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Great. Well, I want to thank the journalism faculty for giving me this great honor in Don's name. It's the best honor I've ever had and ever will have, I'm sure. And I want to thank Terry Williams and what he has done, what he's with the Nashua Telegram and through the McLean contributorship to fund this great program. Before I get going, this talk is not about Don, although I wish it could be because I could talk all night about Don. I want to say a little something about Don, and I'm going to use an email from my friend Dave Cohen, who's sitting in the middle here, to help me do it. When I got this announcement, I got a nice note from Dave, another old Murray student and an old colleague of mine from the North Shore, and a very close friend. Dave is the longtime editor, one of the editors at the Boston Globe magazine, and certainly I didn't know he was going to be here. I'm going to say it anyway, one of the best line editor I or anybody else has ever had the privilege to work with. So this is the email exchange between Dave and I. This is me. Got to give Don credit. I may be the student he made the most of from the least. Dave gets back. A lot of us qualified as sub-raw material, John. Average schlubs with specific drive who bowed to Murray's coaching. By pretending to be dumb and claiming to learn from his students, Murray made some of us believe we were smarter than we really were. It was an effective ploy. This unwarranted confidence was critical to our development and advancement. Many who made it, and I was one, were barely qualified for some of the jobs we got, but grew into them. Murray threw us into the pool before we could swim, certain that some of us would learn before drowning. Murray taught us so much more than how to conduct an interview, write a lead, or edit a sentence. What luck for us to have him in our lives when we did. So thank you, Don. There's a lot of people here I'd like to introduce, but the one I'm going to is my wife and colleague, Naomi Shalit, and I'll be mentioning her and some of you other folks as we go along. The false god of journalism and leaving it behind. Last fall, I attended a panel conference at Colby College called From JFK to the Marathon Bombing, 50 Years of Crisis Reporting. A panelist told a story that illustrates one face of the false god journalism is worshiping with an ever-increasing devoutness. Adam Goldman is a co-author of the AP's Pulitzer Prize series about the New York City Police Department's counterterrorism program. While at the AP, he's at the Washington Post now, he was assigned last September to cover the mass shooting at the Washington, D.C. Navy Yard. This was less than a year after the Newtown, Connecticut school shooting. The dangers of getting things wrong should have been fresh in the minds of journalists after that multiple rush-to-judgment errors made in the coverage of Newtown, including identifying the actual shooter's brother as the shooter. Here's what Adam Goldman said at the Colby Conference. I'll give you one other example of this pressure for us to break news, and I ended up having to do a corrective on this. I think he meant correction. It wasn't a major deal, but during the Naval Yard shooting, I had a source tell me that, and we're obsessed with guns, as reporters are, right? The source said, well, what kind of guns were used in Newtown, my editor said. What kind of gun was used in the Navy Yard? They wanted to know that. It's a fleeting scoop that lasts for like 20 seconds. Nobody really cares what kind of gun they used. A source had told me, yeah, it was an AR-15 that was used in the Naval Yard shooting. So I told my editor. And then another reporter independently says, yeah, it was an AR-15. So now we have two independent sources saying it was an AR-15, good sources. He later tells us these were anonymous sources. Back to Adam. Turned out there wasn't an AR-15 in the Naval Yard shooting. So where did we fall down? It was an initial report from the scene, somebody passing through. Law enforcement responded that they saw an AR-15 by the dead gunman, and they put that in a report, and the report generated its way up the chain. And people saw that, and they conveyed that to us. But while we treated this as almost fact and put it on the wire, law enforcement never intended it to be fact. So here were Adam's editors, just months after a pledge from the media, the mainstream media, not just the upstarts, to return to valuing being right over being first and doing just the opposite by quoting unnamed sources. Anonymous sources that got it wrong. That's one problem with anonymous sources. They often get it wrong because why care about getting it right when you're not held accountable for what you say? And even if it is accurate, readers cannot judge the value of material for themselves if they don't know the source. Many sources who hide behind anonymity do so to take cheap shots without anyone knowing they have an axe to grind or a dog in the fight. And even more importantly, the frequent and usually unnecessary use of anonymous sources reinforces the distrust readers already have for journalists. We ask to be trusted, then over and over again give readers reasons to do the opposite. 2013 was a banner year for bad reporting, much of it because of this accelerated rush to be first and turn those scoops into page views. Kevin Smith is chair of the Ethics Committee for the Society of Professional Journalists. He wrote in the January issue of Quill magazine that based on the hundreds of calls to the Society's ethics hotline, quote, "This might be the worst collapse of journalism standards we've seen in 50 years. Thanks to the 24-hour news cycle, social media, and the uncontrollable urge to be first to report, this has created a wrecking ball on our ethics." This false god, relying on anonymous sources to be first with a story, has been a problem a long time for journalism. There used to be two major causes of this problem. Now there's a third, and it threatens not only our journalism, but our democracy. At the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting, we picked this quote from Jefferson as our motto: "Whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. Citizens are not well informed when we get it wrong just to be first." So why do we use anonymous sources? The two traditional reasons for relying on anonymous sources are lazy reporters and competition. Sometimes it's hard getting a source to go on the record. You may have to call more than one person. You may have to find the information by putting down the phone and knocking on a door. Sometimes a story is hard to write without that key quote, the quote that says what you want to say, but no one will go on the record with that quote. So, you call up someone who sees it as you do and offer anonymity and get the quote you need. It ain't right, but it's done. As Adam Goldman admitted in that Colby conference, because guess what? I can get a source on the phone and just about get anything out of that person you know. They'll speculate this or that. The drive to get it first and use an anonymous source to help you also comes from the long tradition of competition. That's mostly been a macho tendency, seen in men and women, to win for the sake of winning and getting very temporary bragging rights. But until the web came along, with its ability to know right now how many people are reading your story, page views, clicks, there wasn't a significant financial pressure to get it first, unless you go way back to the days of the yellow press and the big city circulation wars. Now, readers have become eyeballs. Eyeballs click on your story, tweet it, post it, put it on Facebook, maybe it gets hot and it gets on Reddit. All those eyeballs become pennies and pennies become dollars. Those eyeballs are hungry, but we have to keep shoveling food at them regardless of its nutritional value. As Brendan Nyan, a Dartmouth government professor, wrote recently in the Columbia Journalism Review, the near infinite size of the news hole that media outlets are now expected to try to fill online, on cable, and in social media, even when there is little new or accurate information available, exacerbates the challenges and creates perverse incentives. There appear to be four certain ways for winning the race for page views. Let's call them cats, quizzes, Kardashians, and catastrophes. The amateurs can take care of the cats. The celebrity sites hold a lock on the Kardashians. Ethnic aside, they are an embarrassment to my immediate side of my family. BuzzFeed and its ilk take care of the quizzes. That leaves to us, the news media in all our forms, the bombings, the invasions, the mass shootings, and the missing planes. That's what we have always been good at because it takes real reporting, real visuals, real experience. The demand for coverage of such events has always been high. Back in the print-only days, page one coverage of events, from assassinations to moon landings to military invasions, would sell out even when we reprinted thousands of extra papers. But those extra copies never meant that much money. The cost of printing and delivering those copies ate up a good part of the extra sales. And that one-time bump in circulation didn't translate into very much higher ad rates. Now that has changed. The cost of publishing news updates, for example, no longer means more newsprint, more ink, more delivery trucks on the road. And those updates can be turned into revenue that mostly flows to the bottom line because they are not associated with a lot of extra expense. Just make the reporter work faster. Readers, and I use readers for lack of a better term, expect it all right now. And if you give it to them, they flock to your web pages, Twitter accounts, and other digital platforms. That translates into pressure to get it first at any cost. And since we are not supposed to make it up, and because the people who can give us the latest information often don't want to be quoted, we let them go anonymous. And sometimes, quite a bit of the time, either have it wrong or are just providing speculation or using the cover of anonymity to take a cheap shot. Just consider the coverage of the missing Malaysian airliner. Much of it was speculation based on unnamed sources. It got so bad that even a CNN anchor a few nights ago refused to go along with it any longer. And it was so pronounced, Naomi pointed out to me with surprise one day that she found a whole story about the plane crash without one anonymous source. Kudos to the Washington Post, where a previous Murray lecturer, our old colleague Kevin Sullivan, I'm sure had something to do with doing things right at the Post. The tragedy of the overuse of anonymous source reporting is that we in the business have known for decades that we are abusing it, have known for decades that readers abhor it, and have promised for decades we are going to toss this false god into the abyss. I know, anonymous sources, it sounds so exciting, film noirish, having a deep throat slipping you the good stuff. But let's make a distinction about sources first. There's the anonymous tipster and the anonymous source. They are not the same. The anonymous tipster may give you documents, suggest lines of inquiry, tip you off to something juicy. You may know her name, you may not. Their documents may come in plain brown envelopes, no return address, which happened to us a couple years ago and led to a pretty good story about cronyism in the University of Maine state system. But here's the thing, you never use that information unless you can verify it on the record. You do what you need to do to ensure the document is legit. You follow up on their tip and uncover documents or get on the record interviews that confirm or don't confirm the tip from your source. There's no credibility problem with that, so long as we publish only what we can put on the record or have a record to back it up. At the Maine Center, we have not, in 4+ years, and nearly 200 investigative stories, used a single unattributed quote in our stories. We have taken advantage of a good many anonymous or off-the-record tips, but if we could not confirm that tip with an on-the-record source or document, we have not used it. We have lost a story or two that way. One was about problems in the State Department of Environmental Protection. We tried very hard to get that story, and despite all of Naomi's pleadings, the key sources would not go on the record. They went to another reporter whose paper did not have as strict a policy as we do, and the story got published and the unnamed sources were quoted. The other sort of anonymity is what you find too often in news stories. And I am not talking primarily about bloggers and startup websites. I'm more concerned with the traditional media that is still the primary source of almost all news, because very few other news media do more than feed off the original reporting done by newspapers, news services, and the networks. The ones that still have reporters going to City Hall and the State House and sending teams to plane crashes. These are the reporters and editors we still depend on to get the news. By the way, there's a new sort of journalism group that does the old-fashioned shoe leather reporting. This is the growing nonprofit news organizations like ours. There are about 80 of us. We are the new fresh things in the journalism horizon in that we are organized as nonprofits and don't depend on ad revenue, but instead on donations and grants. But what we do journalistically is often classic journalism. Groups like ours, like the national ones, like ProPublica, the regional ones, like the one at BU, perform original, in-depth reporting, usually accountability and watchdog journalism with a focus on government. Let me stop here and agree that anonymous sources are sometimes necessary. Watergate would not have been broken without them. Diplomacy depends on, well, diplomacy. So no diplomat will ever say anything candid on the record because it could start an international crisis. And really, someone's life or health is truly at stake. In my career as a reporter and editor, I can recall using an anonymous source only once, in a series on police brutality in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The source was a corroborating witness of a beating at a hospital waiting room where she worked in admitting. After seeing police repeatedly bash the suspect's head on the hospital floor, and knowing of such a pattern of behavior in that police department, it was not being unreasonable to think she could be a victim herself, so we granted her anonymity. An aside, the police were desperate to get her name. I was deposed under oath and declined to give them a name, citing my First Amendment rights 99 times. You heard people taking the fifth, I took the first. They took the newspaper and me to state court where they got a judge's order requiring us to reveal the source or be held in contempt. One day before I was likely going to jail, a federal judge intervened and we eventually won that case. When I broke into the business in the late 1960s, it was a time when professionalism was on the rise and was muscling out the old school approach. Not every one of those old school reporters abided by the tough guy saying, "Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story," but a few still did. And I worked with one. And so did Lisa and Andy, who's not here, and Dave and Paul, and a few other grads who maybe we can pass the story on to. He was my first city editor, and he seemed cast for the part by Hollywood. He smoked cigars down to the nub, cheated on his expense account, wore stripes and plaids together, and was known to say, "Don't take anything you can't eat or drink in one day." Stuck for a good quote, he would often make up something and attribute it to a West Gloucester man or a West Gloucester woman. That would be him or his wife, the inimitable Bunny. His name was Bill, and I loved him, loved his enthusiasm and his knowledge of the town, and loved that I got a glimpse of the old school newspapering from working with Bill. But he was not a model of journalism ethics, that sense of professionalism that overtook the business in the 1970s. And while we, the new breed, may have reported and written more professionally, the problem of credibility hung on. We traded the wisecracking on the street-style quotes for something that sounded more high-toned. The source close to the mayor or a spokesman no name used. But it all means the same thing to the reader. They don't know who is speaking, so they don't trust it. They can't tell if it's real or made up. They can't tell if the source has an agenda or is even knowledgeable. By the 1980s, readers were beginning to say they were losing trust in the news media. We weren't down there with the proverbial used car salesman, but we weren't being rated all that much higher. Depending on the reasons, that may be fine. We have a job to do, and no one loves a reporter who tells a town its police department is corrupt. That goes with the territory, accepted. But there was another more legitimate problem with credibility. In the mid-1980s, I was the editor of the Beverly Times, a new daily paper on the North Shore of Massachusetts. We, and in the paper and in the industry, were beginning to feel major threats to our business. And the internet was not yet one of them, although it was not too far away from being a disruption bigger than radio or TV had been. Then, just as now, the fear was loss of readership. You lose readers, you lose advertisers. You lose advertisers, you lose 80% of your revenue. But why, back then, were we in the whole industry worried about losing readers and seeing this erosion? What does anybody do when they have a fundamental question about their business? They commission a study. Among the findings of the study were that readers didn't trust what they read. And one major reason for the lack of trust was, and I'm quoting the study, running stories that quote unnamed sources. 15 years later, in 1999, the threats had not abated, and the loss of readers was accelerating. And now comes the web and threats from all sorts of media websites to the dominance of what we now call the legacy media. Another study was commissioned. That study, funded by one of the very same groups who funded the first study, created a study called Examining Our Credibility. Among the findings, quote, while focus group participants were surprisingly understanding of newsroom deadline constraints, most expressed a strong preference that newspapers not rush to publish, but focus on getting it right rather than getting it first. As one reader told the researchers, very few things are so urgent that should keep reporters from having to verify a story. I understand the desire to be number one, but that's no excuse not to be accurate. Yet, here we are in 2014, and a reputable news sources, print, broadcast, and web, blame the wrong person for the Newtown shootings, get the wrong type of weapon in the Navy Yard shootings, and get a score of things, big things, wrong about the Boston Marathon bombing. So, who can we look to show us the right way to cover the news? Who stands for the best traditions of quality journalism? You might hope that the acknowledged best in the business paper, now more than a paper, the New York Times, will be setting that high standard for credibility. But that is not always the case. The Times' policies are strong. Use anonymous sources sparingly, have a strong reason for using them, and explain them in detail. And it has had one ombudsman after another, they call them public editor, saying the right thing over and over again about anonymous sources. Daniel Ockrent was the first public editor. This is what he wrote 10 years ago. Since I've been in this job, the use of anonymous sources has been the substantive issue raised most by readers. As Leonard Wurtzel, a reader of Atlanta, wrote, whenever I come across a phrase like, according to a high official, I translate it to mean, I, the reporter, will now state my opinion and disguise it as news. When Ockrent came across a possible misuse of anonymous sources, he would go to a Times editor for an explanation. And he'd get one, usually something about the quote being so important that it was worth granting anonymity. But I think Ockrent's candid translation of what those editors really meant is more meaningful. What he thinks they were saying is the sources granted anonymity because the Times believed it had already spoken to one of its competitors. So it wasn't for a grand reason, it was for competitive reasons. Ockrent suggested a new policy for using anonymous sources. Treat permission to use an anonymous source like a fire alarm behind a glass door. Break glass only in case of an emergency. Now, let's turn to the Times' current public editor, Margaret Sullivan. She has been consistently strong on limiting the use of anonymous sources and consistently rebuffed. Last August, looking back at her time as a public editor, Sullivan wrote, I don't feel so good about not being able to investigate every complaint, or about failing to make a dent in the long-time problems like the overuse of anonymous sources. She quotes a reader from Vermont, David Steinhardt, complaining about, quote, pointless blind quotes from government officials that can easily serve to mask unaccountable half-truths and lies. I beseech the Times not to facilitate government acting like the Wizard of Oz behind a curtain, when even stated reasons for doing so make no imaginable sense. Sullivan's response, readers are right to protest when they see an anonymity granted gratuitously. That's happening too often. It's time once again to pull in the reins. I've written about this from time to time, as have my predecessors, but to little or no avail. Now, so frustrated by the Times' continued abuse of anonymous sources, Sullivan is escalating her critique. She has started Anonymous Watch, a feature devoted solely to the Times' use and often misuse of anonymous sources. Despite the promises to stop worshiping this false god, despite the pleadings of other journalists, not just the Times public editors, it never stops. As I was working on this lecture on Friday, I took a break to catch up on the Times and read the coverage of Christie, no relationship, and the bridge controversy. There was a sidebar. Headline, Irate friends see sexism in report on former Christie aide Bridget Ann Kelly. Their friends were all anonymous. An example of the must-have quote, "Anybody that knows Bridget knows she's always been a by-the-book mom with 4 kids," said one who, like others, spoke on condition of anonymity so as not to get entangled in any investigation. How could a quote so innocuous get anyone tangled up in an investigation? It's about motherhood. It's just another case of wanting a story so badly, one that I presume will get many hits because who doesn't like a scandal, that the Times once again forsakes its own policies. Every day I look, this problem seems to get worse. The most recent cover story at Columbia Journalism Review has the big headline, "Who cares if it's true?" This was not a parody by The Onion. This was the real headline on the cover of the CJR. And if anyone thinks this is just a theory that content is driven by page views, I came across a recent piece by David Carr of The Times about, quote, "growing trend in many corners of journalism to tie the compensation of journalists to the amount of web traffic or articles they generate. This is spread from the digital-only sites like The Street and Gawker to The Oregonian, one of the most respected daily papers in the country. Reporters there will soon be working under a quota system that requires a minimum number of posts per day, and that number will escalate in time. And when you're under that sort of pressure, the sort of pressure Adam Goldman was under at the AP, there will be a temptation, if not a necessity, to put up the unconfirmed, the unnamed source, speculation, rumor, and other stuff that does not pass the rule we learned long ago in Don Murray's class. As I recall, the rule was something like this. There are 2 rules of reporting, accuracy and accuracy. And if I were to add a third, it would be accuracy. You may see now the dilemma that I see in all this, and it's this. Journalists, journalism critics, research, comments from readers all stress the importance of credibility. Yet, the more we put out, the faster we put it out, right or wrong it seems, the greater the success. If you measure success solely by the people who look at what you write and the page views, that do turn into revenue, which we do need. I doubt this dilemma can be decisively resolved. But from what I have been reading in journalism journals, and from what I hear in the many community groups that Naomi and I speak to, readers do want credibility. They crave news, but they value credibility too. To those that say that my argument ignores the inevitability of what is now called post-platform journalism, the idea that these standards are outdated, that journalists from my era just don't get it, I found the following comment from the Times ethicist writer about 2 weeks ago very comforting. "Just because something is inevitable," wrote Chuck Klosterman, "does not make it moral." Can we survive and be moral, or as I'd say ethical? I don't have that answer. Despite what appears to be a decline in our commitment to credibility, though, there are a couple of positive signs. First, the new media can be and often is an aid to accuracy. Postings on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media, all are sources reporters can use that potentially add up to more sources than a single reporter can develop on her own. All a reporter needs to make use of that fresh material is a thing that Hemingway recommends that you acquire and hone if you don't already have one. Stop laughing, Cohen. It's called a built-in shock-proof shit detector. You need one if you don't have one. The other hopeful note, let's go back to Adam Goldman in the conference at Colby. I asked him at the end of the panel conference what he thinks of the abuse of unnamed sources and what can be done about it. Here's what he said. "I wish my editors would say, can't use it unless it's on the record. And I'd say, okay, I'll fight like hell to get on the record. Might not be a whole lot of new information, but at least you know who was saying it, right? I'm down with that. Let's have a revolution in the newsroom. I think it would be great. There'd be less information out there for the public, but you're right, at least we know who was saying it." Adam has it right. Every reporter can pledge, as Daniel Arkwright said, to use anonymous sources only in an emergency. It will help if editors and publishers get on that wagon too. And we all recognize we are trading our birthright for short-term gains. The press is the only business, the only craft protected by the Bill of Rights. We should be grateful and ennobled by that honor that grants us the unique an essential role in our democracy. The true God we're duty-bound to serve. Thank you.
Have any questions for John? Anybody?
So, when you started talking, when you first started talking, you mentioned the business model of nonprofits. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and how that might portend for the future for other publications.
You know, first off, I don't use the term business model. I don't even know what the hell it means. I'm a businessman. But how we're funded, how we make money. All right, let's make it simple. Where the money comes from. The money comes from foundations and donors. It's nothing different than thousands of other nonprofits. So there isn't anything new about how we get the money. It's just we're doing something. Journalism hasn't been charity, but we've had many charities for hundreds of years. So I don't think there's a whole lot new in that. What it pretends, I'm not completely encouraged about, because foundations are helping us quite a bit now, but foundations don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So we've got to get donors, individuals to give us money. We're doing that. We're succeeding in doing that. But in Maine, it's a small state, so it's difficult. I think right now we've got 80 or 90 of these groups. I think if we're going to survive, the nonprofit model is going to survive, we're going to have to consolidate. We're going to have to stop repetition and doing the same thing in different states that we could do in one place. The legacy media maybe needs to adopt us and have some sort of cooperative agreement with the paid media, so maybe hire us to be their specialist. The ones that are really crowing about how well they're doing, and we're doing okay, but the ones really crowing about it are the ones who have big sugar daddies, $5 and $10 million. Most of us don't have that. So you see a lot of groups like ours who are in the range of a $200,000 to $1 million budget that are dependent upon foundations. And the foundations aren't going to do it forever. They're getting donors locally, but I think we build this thing the way it is. We get it to a point that people see it's successful in terms of what we can produce, and it's really needed. And we're going to have to then create some partnerships with, I think, paid media or larger foundations or larger news organizations to get it working. So we spend more of our money on content, and we have some consolidation on all the other things that cost money, whether it's libel insurance or rent or web design. I think we're just it's a little bit jumping off the cliff and growing the wings on the way down. But we're hoping that we know the content's very popular. And with some cooperation with the national group we're working in, it's vague. I understand that. And we don't know for certain. But I think you hope that good content without, but that it's not a quiz. We don't have anything on our website that can tell you what kind of rock band you are. Derek.
Well, given the fact that you left everything on the record, how do you feel about the effort to get a federal shield law in place that would do exactly what you don't want to have happen, and that's protect sources?
Well, I think that's different. I think that doesn't mean you should start using more anonymous sources because you got a shield law. The ethics of the business should be distinct from how much the protection should be on a federal basis. And my problem with the shield law has always been, if they can give it, they can take it away. And we haven't had that many problems using the Constitution to protect ourselves. Not that many reporters have gone to jail. Not that many reporters have failed to do the job because they were threatened by that. Sources are being prosecuted because they're violating the standards of their federal jobs. That's a problem for us, but it's a different problem. I know some states have shield laws. They do pretty well with them. The states that don't have them seem to do well, too.
John, could you please explain briefly what a shield law is for some of the students in the room?
Well, if I get wrong, it would be a law that says that if you would use an anonymous source, tell me if I'm wrong, Terry, the government could not force you to reveal that source, and then therefore perhaps go to jail, right? Yeah. Right now, that's not generally the case. If you're in a suit and you have an anonymous source, and that person wants to defend themselves in that suit, let's say it's a lawsuit, they can call you to testify. And you could say, I can't help you. Sorry, it's an anonymous source, and they can get a judge. They have in the past to say, no, I'm sorry, reported. You're not special. We say we have the First Amendment. Well, you're not that special. There's other amendments, you know. There's right to a fair trial. That's an amendment too, and that trumps your right to keep an anonymous source, and then force you to either reveal that source or be held in contempt. If you're held in contempt, you can be put in jail, and reporters have been put in jail from time to time.
Can you share any tips you have for getting sources on the record? Just again, as a model for young journalists taking on tough stories, maybe?
You try a lot of people. You ask them what is it they're worried about. You say, well, okay, we won't go in that territory. Can you talk about these 3 things and not that one thing? They might be glad to do that. You might tell them, look, you're not going to be the only source. They might feel like, I know I've had some sources, they had the sense that if they talked to me, they were going to be in the headline with their name. Judy says government wrong. I said, no, Judy, it's okay. I'm not going to do that. You're going to be one of 17 people I quote, and you're not going to be in the headline. It's not an agreement I'm making with her, because I know that's the case because I'm working the story. And that calms some people down. They don't quite picture how it's going to happen. The other thing is to ask them if they can't go on the record deal, somebody will, or can they point us, which is even better really, to a document. There's so many things that are on the record. They might say, hey, use the Freedom of Information Act to get the emails between this guy and this guy on these 3 months, and you're going to find out what I'm telling you about. And I think after all those are exhausted, either you possibly sometimes just don't do the story. You have to admit that. There are cases where that shouldn't happen. Okay, in Watergate, not doing the story would have been an ethical error probably, but not every story is Watergate.
Do you have any solution or procedure to convince other news organizations to stop using anonymous sources?
Yes, yelling loud at them. I don't know if Margaret Sullivan at the New York Times, and she has written I don't know how many pieces saying this about her own newspaper, and they all say, you're right, Margaret, we're going to stop doing it, and the next day they do it. I think that the public has to write letters, has to complain about it. Some organizations have to start announcing they have a new policy and then live up to it. We have an organization, the Society of Professional Journalists, SPJ, that has a very strong part of the code of ethics on anonymous sources. And although we're not professional, we don't hold our hand up and swear an oath to the SPJ code, we all know about it. Yeah. I think just constantly calling attention. In all my years in journalism and in newspapering, there's lots of types of problems in newspapers, and the only solution I ever found to any of them was to keep talking about it and keep calling attention to it. When I was a writing coach and we would talk about good writing and editing, and it would get better, and then we'd say, well, okay, that's good, we'll go do something else and talk about something else, and it would just go back to the way it was. Just keep the attention on it.
So you use that one example of when you cite an anonymous source in Gloucester, Massachusetts.
Gloucester, that's right, yeah.
With the police brutality. Can you think of any other extreme examples in which it would be okay to use an anonymous source?
I think somebody's health or safety at stake. Often people say my job's at stake. I think you'd have to be genuinely convinced that that was the case and that the story was going to be worth using the anonymous source. I think there's always a balance between how good's a story and how much do you want to sacrifice to an anonymous source. I think when people are in situations that overseas in Syria or something, they're not going to get people on the record. And if you wouldn't necessarily get their right name anyhow. So I think in those severe situations it's true. People who perhaps in the military who are going to tell you things and you can see what might happen to them if they told you what was going on. Those can be exceptions. But I think if you need to use one, it's got to be a lot of people in your organization discussing it, talking about it, finding ways around it. And then if you use them, you really do have a better explanation than you often see, which is they didn't want to be anonymous because they didn't want their name used. It's circular. Now, you know, and even more than their name, who are they? Why do they know this? And why is it important? And then get multiple people who tell you the same thing before you use it. Some on the record, some off the record. It's just getting out of control.
Would you say, as far as like governmental like investigative reporting, would you say it's like more challenging to find like a valid source that's like more willing to talk, opposed to like other types of investigative reporting?
Probably, because people in government are worried about their jobs, so it is harder. But on the other hand, they know a lot and they can tell you where to find the information. When we did the story about the cronyism in the university system, it's really a pretty telling thing. We had a governor, John Baldacci, a Democrat, who had finished his 2 terms. He couldn't get reelected. So near the end of his last term, we noticed that every month or two, someone would get a job in the University of Maine system, a high-level job in finance usually, or administration, that had had a job in the Baldacci administration. And they were going to lose that job because once the governor's out, his top people go out with them. Even if another Democrat comes in, they couldn't be guaranteed. But they get into the university system, no offense to those in the university system here, there's administrators, so they're the awful people. They keep those jobs forever. They don't have to worry about what the governor is. So we saw 2 or 3 of them do this and think that maybe there's a story in this. This looks kind of funny. This is fishy. And as I said in one of the classes the other day, the first thing you need to be an investigative reporter is just to have a really suspicious point of view on the world. Then we got in the mail one day the proverbial, and it doesn't happen much. I mean, the first or second to happen to me, plain brown envelope, no return address. And this person who sent it had no idea that we had this story idea in our head. And in that envelope were a lot of hiring records from the University of Maine system, pointing out even more examples of what we thought were the case. And that was a good tip in that we found that those documents were legit. It led us to ask for more documents. But then a couple of times we ran across a roadblock and we had no idea how to reach this person because we just had a plain brown envelope. So we put something up on our website. We said, "Dear Pine Tree Watchdog Tipsters," what they called them?
Pine Tree Tipsters.
Pine Tree Tipsters. You know, please give us a call. We've got some more questions. And we would get a call from a blocked number or something in the mail from them. And we published a story. We didn't use any anonymous quotes. We didn't use any documents that we did not also get from the university system, but we knew what to ask for because these people fed it to us. And that guy called me up afterwards and it told me who he was and why he had called me. He had worked for one of these departments and he got kind of upset. He wasn't an applicant for these jobs, but he had to work for one of these guys who was put into one of these jobs. And as those from us from Massachusetts know, we call those people hacks. And he didn't like working for a hack.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Good.